Most gardeners today, actually starve their soil while thinking they're feeding their plants. They pour nutrients in from a bag or a bottle, see fast green growth, and just assume the system is working. But then yields stall, flavor drops, pests increase, and the soil turns into something that only grows plants if you keep propping it up with more inputs. That's not a mystery. That's exactly what happens when soil biology is ignored. Long before fertilizers existed, gardeners fed soil in ways that built fertility year after year instead of burning it out. And honestly, those methods still outperform modern inputs when you care about long-term results. If you grow food seriously, whether in the ground, raised beds, or even hydroponics, understanding how soil was fed before fertilizers is not optional knowledge. It's foundational. Soil used to be treated as a living system, not just a nutrient delivery medium. Historically, soil wasn't something you corrected with numbers, it was something you maintained. The goal wasn't maximum short-term growth, it was stable, repeatable production with minimal failure. That meant feeding the organisms that actually make nutrients available, not force-feeding plants directly. Old gardens were biologically active by default because they were constantly receiving organic material. Every bed was part of a cycle. Crop residues went back into the soil. Kitchen waste went into compost. Manure came from animals that ate local forage. Nothing was sterile and nothing was wasted. When you look at old market gardens that stayed productive for decades, the common factor isn't special compost recipes. It's, consistent organic input and time. Compost wasn't a product, it was a process that never stopped. Before bagged compost, gardeners made it continuously, often without even thinking of it as a separate task. Pile size mattered. A useful compost pile was big enough to heat, usually at least 3 feet by 3 feet, but not so large that it went anaerobic. Carbon came from straw, leaves, or dried weeds. Nitrogen came from kitchen scraps, green weeds, and manure. A working ratio hovered around 2 parts dry material to 1 part green, but honestly, no one measured it precisely. They adjusted by smell and temperature. If it stank, it needed more carbon. If it didn't heat, it needed more nitrogen. That feedback loop matters more than any recipe. In a modern backyard garden, spreading just 1 cubic yard of compost over 4 4x8 raised beds once a year, that's really all you need to keep the soil fertile indefinitely, so long as the beds are otherwise protected. And that's not just some theory, it's something that can be repeated year after year. Manure was always aged, diluted, and, honestly, respected. It was never dumped raw. Raw manure can burn plants and completely wreck soil biology. The older gardeners, they knew this because they'd seen the damage firsthand. Manure was typically aged, often for 6 months to a year, before being put on the garden. In some systems, it was even composted with straw or leaves. In others, it was turned into what they called manure tea. A common practice was to soak a burlap sack of manure in a barrel of water for several days, then dilute that liquid until it looked like, weak tea. That solution was poured around the plants, not on the leaves, and never on dry soil. This method, you see, fed the microbes first and the plants second. In raised beds today, a diluted manure tea applied once every 2 to 3 weeks during heavy feeding periods works better than synthetic fertilizer without the salt buildup. In hydroponics, the principle carries over as microbial inoculation rather than nutrient supply, which is why biologically active systems outperform sterile ones over time. Crop residues were returned to the soil instead of being removed. Modern gardens are kept too clean. Old gardens weren't. After harvest, stalks, leaves and roots were chopped and turned back into the bed. This fed fungi, maintained soil structure, and prevented nutrient export. Leaving roots in place mattered. Root channels became air and water pathways. Microbial colonies stayed intact. The soil wasn't reset every season. So, in practical terms, cutting plants at soil level instead of pulling them, then covering beds with compost or mulch, actually reduces the need for added fertility by a noticeable margin within, say, 2 seasons. Mulch was used to feed soil, not just suppress weeds. Straw, leaves, wood chips, and even seaweed were used as mulch. But the goal wasn't appearance, really. It was moisture retention and slow decomposition. As mulch broke down, it fed soil life continuously. Leaf mold was especially valued. Piled leaves left to break down for a year or two produced a fungal-rich amendment that improved water retention and nutrient cycling without causing nitrogen lockup. In a backyard garden, a 3-inch layer of shredded leaves applied in fall and left in place through spring does more for soil structure than most fertilizers applied all season. Old gardeners rotated crops not just to avoid pests, but to balance nutrient demand. Heavy feeders followed light feeders. Deep-rooted plants followed shallow-rooted ones. Beds were occasionally rested with cover crops or left fallow. Legumes were grown specifically to rebuild soil. They weren't a bonus crop, they were part of fertility management. When turned in at the right time, before flowering, they added nitrogen without destabilizing the system. Even in raised beds, rotating crops and including at least one season of legumes every few years, well, it really reduces the need for external inputs dramatically. Soil amendments were local and mineral, not chemical. Before fertilizers, gardeners added what their land lacked. Wood ash supplied potassium and trace minerals, but it was used sparingly, often no more than a few handfuls per bed per year. Too much raised pH and caused problems, and they knew it. Crushed bones, shells and lime were added where calcium was low. These broke down slowly and supported long-term structure rather than short-term growth. In modern gardens, adding minerals based on soil behavior rather than test numbers often works better. Poor drainage, weak stems, and low disease resistance are usually mineral balance issues, not nutrient deficiencies. Hydroponics didn't exist, but the principle still applies. Even in hydroponics, the old approach holds. Systems that rely entirely on sterile nutrient solutions require constant correction. Systems that incorporate microbial life, organic inputs, or biologically derived nutrients stabilize over time. The lesson from pre-fertilizer gardening is that plants don't want to be force-fed. They want access to a functioning system that delivers what they need when they need it. The real takeaway is that soil fertility was built, not bought. Gardens before fertilizers succeeded because fertility accumulated instead of being consumed. Each season made the next one easier. That's, the opposite of most modern gardens, which become dependent on inputs. If you want better yields, better flavor, and fewer problems, stop thinking in terms of feeding plants and start thinking in terms of feeding systems. Compost regularly, return organic matter, use manure with restraint, mulch heavily, rotate intelligently. That approach works in backyard beds, raised systems, and even modified hydroponic setups because it's grounded in how plants actually interact with their environment. If this kind of practical, experience-based growing knowledge helps you grow better food, subscribe to Easy Garden Life. And if you know other gardeners who are tired of chasing problems instead of building soil, share this video with them. Better gardens come from better understanding, not better marketing.